Welcome to biology. In this video, we are continuing our biochemistry unit, and we are focusing in on bonding and the many forms and ways in which it can happen. Now, just starting off here with our definition of chemical bonds. So a chemical bond is some kind of force that holds atoms together, and that bond is forming because of the valence electrons. Now this force is electrical. So think of that electrical force that you get when you rub a balloon on your hair and it makes your hair stand up in all sorts of crazy directions. That's because you're creating this electrical charge when you're using that friction. Now, chemical bonds are also kind of like a magnet because some of these involve having a positive and a negative charge that are attracted together. So chemical bonding involves those valence electrons, or the outermost shell of electrons. Now, atoms that have a full outermost shell, which means that they have 8 electrons in the outer layer, they're totally happy. They don't want to bond. They're not going to react with any other atoms. If an atom does not have a full outermost shell, they do react with other atoms, because they're trying to get 8 electrons in the outer shell. So either they're trying to give away some of their electrons or grab electrons from another atom. And once they have 8 electrons in their outer shell, they're happy and they stop reacting with other atoms. Now, hydrogen is the exception to this. Hydrogen is totally happy when it has 2 valence electrons, but that's really the only type of atom that is happy like that. Everything else really wants to have 8. There's several types of bonds, and we're starting here with ionic bonds. Now, kind of the key takeaway here, ionic bonds are super duper strong, and they form between a metal and a non-metal. But you also need to understand how they form. And what happens is one of the atoms grabs or steals or transfers electrons from another atom. And the way that this happens, and I have the example down here of sodium chloride, which is table salt. Sodium has 1 electron in its outermost shell, and sodium's not happy. Sodium wants to have 8. So what happens is sodium tries to give away that outermost electron. Chlorine has 7 electrons in the outermost shell. And again, it wants to have 8, so it wants to take that 1 electron away from sodium and add it to its outermost shell, so that way it is happy with 8. So then sodium got rid of that extra 1, and that next ring down had 8, so now sodium's happy. And chlorine has 8 because it added 1. But what happened is that sodium still has the same number of protons in the nucleus, but it now has 1 less electron. And normally the protons and electrons balance each other out. But because it has more protons than it has electrons now, it has a slight positive charge. And chlorine still has the same number of protons, but since it added an electron to the outermost shell, it now has more electrons than protons, so it has a slight negative charge. So in this process of sending one of the electrons over, we now have a positive and a negatively charged atoms. And that positive and negative acts like a magnet, and they stick together really, really strong. And that's how that bond is formed. So think of this as stealing an electron. So if an atom ends up with more electrons, it becomes negative. And if an atom ends up with more protons than electrons, because it gave away 1 of the electrons, now that atom becomes positive. So we can see that happening here. Again, that sodium and the chloride ions, that is our example for table salt or sodium chloride. You see 1 of the electrons from the sodium atom is being given to the chlorine atom, and now that sodium is short 1 electron and the chlorine has a bonus electron, and that creates these charges, and those opposite charges attract to form the bond. Covalent bonding is the next type of chemical bond. This does not involve any stealing. In fact, covalent bonding involves sharing of electrons. So what happens is neither atom gives an electron away. Instead, they both count each other's electrons as their own. Make sure you remember covalent bonding happens between two non-metal elements, and this creates a molecule with no net charge. So we don't have a positive ion and a negative ion stuck together. So we have none of that. So some examples here are things like water, sugar, ammonia, octane, which is the part of gasoline that kind of combusts. And when you have atoms held together with covalent bonds, we call those molecules. And this picture here on the next slide really demonstrates how that sharing really works. So I have two atoms here, and it doesn't matter what kind of atom they are for this particular example, but both of them have 7 valence electrons that they call their own. And remember, both of these really want to have 8. So what happens is the two atoms get pretty close together, and then they each count one of the electrons from the other as their own. So this image is just showing the outermost electron ring, which are those valence electrons, and those two in the middle, those are the ones that are shared. And because they both want to keep holding on to those 8 valence electrons, the two atoms stick really close together. The third type of bonding is a van der Waals force. And this isn't so much of a bond as it is just this slight attraction. And this is an attraction between charged atoms or molecules. So this is not very strong, and this is the result of when molecules are really close together. If there's just a slightly positive and just a slightly negative, and we're not talking a lot positive or a lot negative, like just a slight tiny little bit, then we can get sort of a bonding or attraction to take place. Now these are very weak. It's very easy to break van der Waals forces. And there are several different types of van der Waals forces. The type that we really kind of narrow in on within biology is hydrogen bonding. So hydrogen bonding is a very weak bond formed when hydrogen bonds with an electronegative atom in another molecule. So the bonding within water is really important here. Now, water molecules are held together by covalent bonds because they share those electrons within that molecule. But when you have two water molecules, they tend to be slightly attracted to each other. And that's because the oxygen side of the molecule has a few extra electrons around it compared to the hydrogen ends of the molecule. So the oxygen end tends to be just slightly negative compared to the positive end. And since we're looking at that positive end that contains hydrogen, that's where it gets the name hydrogen bonding. These bonds play a very important role in living systems, and we have a whole video lecture dedicated to these properties of water, and these water properties are really the result of hydrogen bonding. In summary, chemical bonds are the things that hold atoms together. Atoms want to have an outermost valence electron shell that is full, which means it has 8 valence electrons. And the only way for that atom to have those 8 valence electrons is to do bonding, so to interact with other atoms. Now there are a few main types of bonding that we focus on in this course. Just a brief note that there are more types of bonding, and if you take chemistry, they will go into that much more in depth. But for the scope of this class, we have ionic bonding, which is stealing electrons. There's covalent bonding, which is sharing electrons. And there are van der Waals forces, which are this slight attraction or a very weak bond between slightly charged molecules. The type of van der Waals force that we really focus on in biology is called hydrogen bonds. And those are these van der Waals forces that involve hydrogen that is attached to other molecules and interacts with other compounds. Please send me your thoughts, questions, reactions, feedback, etc. I'll get back to you as soon as you can. And I really hope that you learned something. Again, make sure to rewatch this video if you missed something the first time through.